this for the purpose of this conversation. I think it's important to understand the mindset of our organization and me going around talking about these things. We have, as like a lot of groups, we have an outside firm that we rely on for some political advocacy, advice and marketing and all of that. And one of the things that they said to us after the session, he said, "Are you going to get back out and meet with the editorial boards again?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd like to do that. I think that's important. It's important to have that dialogue." And his comment to me was interesting, longtime political operative, and he said, "I think you should, because I think you guys need to take a victory lap on a lot of the accomplishments that you had this session." And I kind of laughed and I said, "Man, I don't feel like we accomplished anything," you know what I mean? And he started going through it, and I guess the reason why I bring this up, what's somewhat remarkable to me, I think it's important to this conversation, is I've always owned the fact that I'm the out-of-state guy, you know, that I was recruited and came here from somewhere else. And where we got some movement that I thought was very much minimal and along the margins and didn't mean a whole lot and wasn't enough for my liking, a lot of people have been doing this for years, said, "Yeah, but these things have been talked about for years and we could never get any movement on it until you really amp things up this session." So I think where I want to start and kind of walk through that was kind of interesting. When we released our report back in January and then came in and met, the report and the recommendations in it were really historically different for our organization, because our organization has long been an organization that just fought on hold harmless type things, fought to maintain municipal aid, tried to fight off anything that was bad and took a defensive position there, and basically said, you know, keep us whole, don't do anything bad to us, and we've had a good session. And we went into this session with a really strong reform agenda. And it was a reform agenda in terms of how we deliver services that we needed reform. And it was a reform agenda in terms of how we fund services that we needed reform at the local level to be competitive regionally and nationally in those areas. And that's tough in Connecticut, because this General Assembly, from a demographic standpoint, and maybe from a land of steady habits philosophical standpoint, is a General Assembly that's anti-reform. I mean, they maybe not in their individual beliefs, they don't think that, but collectively, they are an anti-reform assembly in the fact that the Democrats generally, again, it doesn't mean all of them are this way, but the Democrats generally are reluctant to reform the spending side of government. They don't like to get into the labor reforms and the collective bargaining stuff, and they very much are more toward the let's get a chicken in every pot type of mentality and figure out how to keep doing that. So, we run up against that reluctance of reform on spending controls a lot with the Democrats. But then the Republicans on the flip side are very reluctant to have any conversation around tax reform or funding reform. And the reason why is, particularly this last election, you had a lot of turnover where the Republicans and GOP picked up a lot of seats, and a lot of those people ran off of an anger, that was out there within the electorate, and they ran on these no tax pledges that I won't support any tax increases at all. So when you start talking about funding reform and you start saying, we have to fund services differently, we need to reduce the over-reliance on the property tax and then grab some capacity in other areas that make sense to make us more taxing competitive, they don't want to talk about those reforms because they think that it may be contrary to their no tax pledge, that I can't increase funding in one area to reduce it in another because somebody's going to say that I lied on the campaign trail. So right out of the gate, we went into session with those dynamics in place where we're pushing for broad reform on both sides, and we're getting pushback from both sides saying, the Democrats saying, yeah, I'll talk to you about tax reform, I think you're right, but I won't talk to you about spending reform, and Republicans saying, I'll talk to you about spending reform, but I won't talk to you about tax reform. And those worlds just kind of beat their heads against each other for several months. In the end, I guess where some people saw victory is because they had to come together and negotiate, there were very marginal things done in all of those areas. some of them, to me, almost meaningless by themselves, but at the same time, if you look at them on a more historic and global type process, there are conversations that are being forced now that were never had before. And there are even some studies in this budget that at least recognize that these things need to be dealt with, and perhaps in ways that they hadn't before. One of the big ones was probably about a week before the Republicans released the budget that ultimately passed and was vetoed. I had met with their leadership and continued this push about how we need tax reform at the local level. Went back to the sales tax stuff, and I said, look, I know you've dug your heels in, I know you're not going to do it, but you can't ignore this problem any longer. Our urban centers can't compete nationally because of our over-reliance on the property tax, the fact that a lot of them have over 50% of their property tax exempt. We've created a completely failed urban structure in Connecticut, which frankly, in the message I delivered to them, it's always been that way. But in the 80s and 90s and those eras, it was fine to be that way because we had a suburban driven economy. And so as long as the suburbs here were making huge amounts of money and generating large amounts of tax revenue, it was easy for the state to take that and shift it over to the urban centers to fill in the gaps for that failed structure. But now we've hit a point where we're more of an urban-centric economy nationally. We have to compete from an urban center standpoint. And so that's put pressure on our suburbs, and there's no longer the massive amounts of wealth being accumulated in the suburbs to just shift to the urban centers to solve that structural problem. So you have to start addressing it. And the breakthrough was in that budget, which stayed in the final budget, is the GOP, who was resistant to that all along, said, we can't do it right now. We've gone, all session long essentially saying no to these things, but we do recognize it's a real problem. So they put a study in the budget to study revenue diversification, how services are funded at the local level, as their recognition, basically saying that yeah, we may not have liked your solutions, but you're right, this dialogue has to take place. So that was kind of a victory around the margins. And then you get on the other side of it from a cost control standpoint, and there were things like increasing the thresholds on prevailing wage that have been talked about for years that were finally done this session. Again, something very much around the margins, doesn't make a huge difference, but it was one of those marginal battles that Democrats gave in on, where they basically sent the message that we understand we have to start looking at cost. We have to start looking at ways to control spending. On the regionalism side of things, we heard a lot of legislators would say that we needed to do more shared services, we needed to do more regional services, but at the same time, they didn't want to change anything statutorily to allow us to do those things. There was always some resistance there. This session, one of the bills that did ultimately get through is that smaller towns can now, I think it's towns of 10,000 population or less, can now share a superintendent of schools, as opposed to them all having their own separate superintendent of schools. Again, a very marginal victory, but at the same time, a victory and a message that says that people are starting to get it, that at the state level, we have to let go of some of the things that we held sacred in terms of local control and allow some more economy of scale type of things going. So that was an ongoing battle. There were a couple things that we fought for the whole session that I thought were around the margins and should have easily been done that weren't. If you look at proposals, and this is in the shared service arena, if you look at the Democrat proposals that were released by the House Democrats budget mid-session, and if you look at some of the Republican budgets, including the one that passed and was vetoed, had language in it that we pushed for that applied to collective bargaining that said, in terms of regionalism, if a community is going to share services, you have to negotiate a lot of times to do the same thing with 4 or 5 different bargaining units. So everybody, you're combining everybody to do the same job, but they're all represented by all these different bargaining units. And that keeps this from happening. It keeps it from happening across borders. It also keeps it from happening within a town, between the Board of Education and town government side. you get all these bargaining units involved, and you get so many spoons in the stew that nothing can be done. So what we asked for was that if a shared service was being contemplated and there were multiple bargaining units involved, that those bargaining units had to bargain as a coalition. So labor basically had to get together with its different groups and say, okay, we're speaking collectively with one voice because we're all representing people doing the same job. That was something we fought for all session. That was in several budget proposals, but the final budget in the end, it wasn't in there. And my take on that is ultimately some of the people who fought to get that out are the same people who say that we need to regionalize more. You can't really talk about regionalism if you're not willing to take that issue on, because it's a marginal issue, but it's an important issue, and to some degree, I think you speak out of both sides of your mouth if you say you need to regionalize more, but we're not willing to make all of the bargaining units involved bargain as one coalition on a shared service. So that was a reform that didn't happen, that we were very disappointed in. The other thing we fought for all session that I think that we should probably look at, or I'm told we should look at it as a victory. I get frustrated because it didn't go far enough, and to some degree it greatly frustrates me. But if you saw all the pressure that was being put on municipal governments with this budget, one thing that we learned, we already knew, but it really highlighted, was how volatile their bond ratings and everything could be if municipal aid goes away. I mean, we had Moody's not that long ago issue the warnings, outlook negatives, and the downgrades on combined between like 30-something communities all over the state budget crisis. And the one thing that we had been pushing for all session was to say that all the bonding agencies tell our cities and tell our towns that they should essentially have 2 months in reserves. Now it varies. If you bring Moody's or Standard & Poor's in here, they'll tell you, well, there's a lot of factors involved, and it could be a little more, a little less, could be different things depending upon the community. But generally, a good rule of thumb is 2 months of reserves is what a community should have if it's fiscally stable. So what we asked for was 2 months of reserves. It basically equates to about 15% of their budget. So what we asked for is the first 15% of their budget reserve, 15% of a budget reserve of 15% or up to 15% could not be considered as a town's ability to pay an arbitration. In other words, if you're building a fund balance to make sure that you're protecting your bond rating, which ultimately lowers taxpayer costs, and you don't want your bond ratings to be volatile, then the amount of money that the bonding agencies are telling you that you have to have set aside in reserves, that's a true reserve, that they can't come and rob that reserve to give it out in pay raises and things of that nature. And, it is such a basic common sense tenet to say that you don't want to raid the reserves that the bonding agencies are telling you that you have to have. And that legislation worked its way through all the way up until the budget agreement. And the language in the budget agreement got changed. And now, instead of it being budget reserves up the first 15% of your budget reserve, 15% budget reserves can't be considered an arbitration, they changed the language to say the first 15% of your budget reserve can't be considered. So now if you only have a 5% reserve, it's like 4.2% of that reserve can be considered in arbitration and given out in pay raises and things like that in collective bargaining, which we think is ridiculous. That you would take an already volatile budget reserve and then, essentially codify in policy or tell arbitrators, go after it. Just don't go after the first 15% of it, So it's a little bit of, it's a minor